Before we dive into this spine-chilling story, please subscribe for more daily creepy horror stories. So let me set the scene for you. I'm Ethan, 28 years old, and I work as a software engineer. My job's pretty chill, mostly coding from home, which I like. Ever since my family moved out of state a year ago, it's been just me in this place, a quiet suburban home that I've gotten used to. I'm not the social type, to be honest. I thrive on routine and peace. No distractions, no noise. It's perfect for me. Anyway, it was just another evening. I was sitting on the couch, headphones on, totally immersed in my favorite podcast. It was this true crime one, the kind that keeps you hooked. The house was silent, the way I liked it. I was getting into the latest episode when my phone buzzed on the coffee table. Probably just another news update, but I didn't even bother checking it. I didn't care. I was in my own world. Then out of nowhere, the podcast cut off mid-sentence. I thought maybe it was a weird glitch, so I pulled the headphones out of my ears, ready to restart it. But then something strange happened. The room was suddenly filled with this robotic voice, like a distant emergency broadcast. It was so jarring, I almost jumped out of my skin. Emergency alert, viral outbreak confirmed. Follow these survival rules for your safety. I froze, staring at the screen of my phone. Was this some kind of prank? Some marketing stunt? Viral outbreak? Seriously? Then the rules came through, clear and cold, like they were meant to be taken seriously. Rule 1, stay indoors and lock all windows and doors. Rule 2, whatever you do, remain silent. Rule 3, do not consume any food you didn't prepare yourself. Rule 4, do not trust anyone. Rule 5, don't drink water outside. Rule 6, follow the smoke signals to find safe zones. At first, I thought it was just some prank. Seriously, the emergency broadcast, the weird rules. It sounded like something straight out of a bad horror movie. Who would believe that kind of thing? But then, the screams happened, and they weren't just random noises. They were real. You could hear the panic in them, the kind of fear you only hear when someone knows they're not going to make it. I froze. My heart started pounding. I rushed to the window, throwing the blinds up, hoping I was just hearing things. But no, I wasn't. What I saw outside made my stomach drop. There were these figures. They were stumbling down the street, but they weren't walking right, more like dragging themselves. And they weren't just people. Their skin was all messed up, hanging off their bones in places. Their faces, their faces looked like they'd been through hell. It was like a nightmare, but it was real. Zombies. I could barely process it, but I knew what I was looking at. This wasn't some prank. This was happening. I didn't have time to think. I didn't even know what to do. All I could hear in my head were the rules from the broadcast. Stay inside. Lock everything up. Be silent. I ran for the door, slamming the lock shut. I bolted all the windows and just waited. Everything felt still, too still. My own breathing seemed too loud. I crouched in the corner of the living room, trying to stay out of sight, hoping they didn't see me. I kept telling myself to stay calm, but it wasn't easy. The screams outside were getting closer. I could hear people shouting, but I wasn't about to go looking. I had to stick to the rules. I peeked through the blinds again, praying I didn't see anything worse. But of course I did. Mr. Clark, my neighbor, was running toward his car, like maybe he thought he could drive out of this mess. But it was too late for that. Before he could even start the engine, they were on him. I could see him being pulled out of the car, dragged across the ground. His screams were cut short, like someone just turned the volume down on them. The next thing I knew, there was nothing left of him but the sound of tearing flesh and the shuffle of those things. I couldn't tear my eyes away. I don't know why. Maybe I was too shocked to even move. All I knew was I couldn't let that happen to me. Not if I could help it. I backed away from the window. My mind was spinning, my hands shaking. I couldn't stay here forever. I knew that. But for now, I had no choice. Those things were out there, and if I was going to survive this, I had to follow the damn rules. I didn't even know if there was anyone else out there anymore. But one thing was for sure. Mr. Clark wasn't coming back, and I needed to figure out what the hell I was going to do next. And I couldn't let that happen. Not after what happened to Mr. Clark. I didn't dare move from my spot. The silence was suffocating. It was like the air was thick, and every breath felt like it was too loud. The rules kept running through my head, over and over again. Stay inside, lock the doors, be silent. It was all I had, all I could hold on to in this mess. I couldn't afford to mess this up, not when I was so close to surviving. I had to stick to it. It wasn't just some advice, it was my lifeline. One wrong move, one wrong sound, and I'd be just like Mr. Clark, gone. I dared to peek out the blinds, just for a second, just to see if the coast was clear. I didn't hear anything at first, but then I saw them. Shadows moving in the distance. Not just one or two of them, dozens, maybe more. They shambled down the street, dragging their feet, their limbs jerking in unnatural ways. I could barely make out their faces in the dim light, but I didn't need to see them clearly to know what they were. Zombies, the damn things that were tearing through everything. I quickly pulled the blinds back down, my hands shaking. My eyes stung, but I didn't dare blink. I had to stay alert. The rules weren't just some set of instructions anymore. They were the difference between life and death. I couldn't let my guard down, not for a second. I had to follow them, no matter how bad it got. Every time I thought about moving, I reminded myself, if I make a noise, if they hear me, it's over. I could feel the weight of that truth in my chest. It was like every second was stretching into eternity. Not long after I'd seen those shadows outside, I heard something new. Voices. Not the guttural moans of the zombies, but actual human voices. They were shouting, giving orders. I crept to the window as quietly as I could and peeked out again. A group of police officers had shown up, maybe 4 or 5 of them, decked out in riot gear. They were trying to round up a group of people. Survivors, I guess. I could see a couple of families huddled together, some carrying backpacks or clutching kids who looked scared out of their minds. The officers were pointing toward a large van, motioning for everyone to get inside. "Move! Hurry up! We don't have much time," one of the officers yelled, his voice cutting through the eerie silence of the street. It was like watching a rescue mission in a war zone. I wanted to feel hope, like maybe they had a plan to fix all this. But then I saw it, the way the sound carried. It was like it rippled through the night air, and suddenly the shadows I'd seen earlier began to shift. One by one, figures turned toward the noise. The officers must have noticed too, because one of them started waving frantically. "Get in, now!" The survivors tried, but panic makes people slow and clumsy. A kid dropped their stuffed animal, and their mom bent down to grab it. That split-second mistake was all it took. The first zombie broke into a sprint, then another, and another. The officers opened fire, the cracks of gunshots echoing like firecrackers in the stillness. The group of survivors screamed as the officers tried to hold the line. I could see them taking down a few of the zombies, but for every one that dropped, 2 more seemed to replace it. The horde just kept coming, like a tide that wouldn't stop. One of the officers turned to the group, shouting something I couldn't hear over the chaos. He was waving them toward the van again, but it was too late. The horde reached them and everything devolved into chaos. I couldn't watch anymore. I backed away from the window, my hands shaking. I could still hear the screams, the gunshots, and then nothing. Silence. That silence was worse than the noise. I leaned against the wall, my breathing shallow. I didn't want to think about what had just happened, but I couldn't stop. Those officers, they'd tried to help. They'd tried to save people. But the noise, every shout, every shot, had brought more of those things down on them. It was crystal clear now. Noise was a death sentence. I double-checked all the locks on the doors and windows, making sure nothing was loose. I even jammed a chair under the doorknob for good measure. If those officers couldn't make it, there was no way I was surviving out there. The rules were the only thing keeping me alive. The next morning, or what I assumed was morning since I hadn't dared to open the curtains, I was still on edge. My stomach growled, but I couldn't bring myself to eat much. Everything felt wrong. The house was too quiet, like the silence was waiting to burst into chaos. Then I heard it, a voice outside. "Ethan, open up, man, please." I nearly jumped out of my skin. My first thought, zombies don't talk. But my second thought, that voice was familiar. I crept to the window, peering out cautiously. Standing in my driveway, looking like he'd been through hell, was Josh. Josh, my best friend since middle school. He was waving his arms, his face pale and smeared with dirt. His clothes were torn, and I could see scratches on his arms. "Ethan, it's me! Come on, man, let me in!" My heart raced. The rules flashed through my mind. Rule 4, do not trust anyone. I froze. What if it wasn't really Josh? What if he'd been bitten, infected, or something worse? But then he looked up at the window, and our eyes met. I barely made it here. Please! His voice cracked, and I could see tears welling up. I hesitated, my hand hovering near the lock on the door. My brain was screaming at me to follow the rules, to stay safe, but my heart was saying something else. This was Josh, the guy who'd stood by me during every bad breakup, who'd helped me move into this house. Josh, I muttered under my breath, trying to think. Ethan, please! He shouted again, louder this time. I winced, glancing around. The last thing I needed was for him to draw attention, but I could see the desperation in his face. He was trembling, swaying on his feet like he might collapse. I made my decision before I could second-guess myself. I unlocked the door and opened it just enough to yank him inside. Get in! Get in! I hissed, pulling him by the arm. As soon as the door clicked shut behind him, I locked it again, bolting it for good measure. Josh leaned against the wall, panting. Thank you, he said between breaths. His voice was shaky, and he looked like he was about to cry. What the hell happened to you? I asked, keeping my voice low. They're everywhere, Josh stammered, his voice trembling. I was at my girlfriend's place. We had a fight last night, and I left my phone there when I stormed out. I didn't check any messages or calls. He paused, running a shaky hand through his dirty hair. I didn't know, man. I had no idea any of this was happening. He leaned back against the wall, staring at the floor like he was trying to piece it all together. This morning, I went back to her apartment to grab my phone, but when I got there, the door was wide open. The place was trashed, and she was gone. At first, I thought maybe she'd left in a hurry, but then I heard these noises, growling, shuffling. I looked down the hall, and he broke off, swallowing hard. What did you see? I pressed, keeping my voice low. People, but not people, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. They were gray, their skin all torn up like corpses. They were dragging themselves toward me, making these horrible sounds. I froze, Ethan. I couldn't think. I just ran. Josh took another shaky breath, his hands trembling as he spoke. I thought I could make it to my car, but the street was full of them. I tried cutting through backyards, hopping fences, but they were everywhere. I didn't know where to go, and I couldn't stop. I just kept running, and I ended up here. His hands were shaking, and I noticed for the first time just how bad he looked. His scratches weren't bleeding, but they looked fresh. You're not bitten, are you? I asked, my voice sharp. No, I swear, he said, holding up his hands. It's just scratches. I'm fine, man, I promise. I stared at him, trying to figure out if I could believe him. The rules were clear, but this was Josh. I couldn't just throw him back out there. Okay, I said finally. But if you start acting weird, you're out. Fair, he said with a weak laugh. Josh collapsed onto the couch, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. Dirt streaked his face, and his shirt was ripped at the shoulder, exposing a nasty scrape underneath. He looked like he'd been through hell, but there was something about the way he sat there, too steady, too composed, that made me uneasy. I barely escaped, man, Josh said, his voice low and shaking slightly. He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, smearing the grime. Had to fight my way through fences, alleys, even a couple of those things. I thought I was done for. I stood a few feet away, arms crossed, trying to process it all. You fought them? I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. Josh nodded, avoiding my eyes. Yeah, one of them grabbed me when I was hopping a fence. I had to kick it off, kept running after that, didn't stop till I got here. His words hung in the air, but something didn't sit right with me. I didn't know if it was the way he was speaking, like he was rehearsing it, or the fact that he looked way calmer than I felt. I mean, I'd been sitting in silence all night, and my nerves were already shot just from hearing the screams outside. Josh, on the other hand, he was scratched up, sure, but he didn't look nearly as freaked out as I thought he should. You're lucky you made it, I muttered, keeping my distance. Josh leaned back, letting out a bitter laugh. Lucky? Yeah, real lucky. Got chased by zombies and nearly torn apart. Some luck. I forced a weak smile, but my mind was racing. Was it the exhaustion making me suspicious? Or was there really something wrong here? Are you okay? I asked, trying not to sound accusatory. Josh frowned. What kind of question is that? Of course I'm not okay, Ethan. I've been running for my life all night. You think I'd show up here if I wasn't desperate? I raised my hands in surrender. I'm just asking. The rules echoed in my head. Rule 4, don't trust anyone. I wanted to believe Josh was the same guy I'd known since college, but the world had changed overnight. I had no idea what those things outside were capable of, or what they could do to someone who survived an encounter. Look, Josh continued, leaning forward, I just need a place to stay, okay? A few hours to catch my breath, figure out what to do next. That's all. You can trust me. Josh spent the next few hours pacing the living room, occasionally peeking through the blinds. I stayed in the kitchen, trying to keep my distance. Something about his story didn't sit right with me. Maybe it was the way he avoided eye contact, or how he seemed a little too calm given the circumstances. I figured cooking would help clear my head, so I went to grab some cans from the pantry. When I opened the fridge, though, I froze. Stuff was missing. Half a loaf of bread was gone, along with a couple of sandwiches I'd prepped and some fruit I'd tucked away. I hadn't touched any of it, and I knew it had been there this morning. Josh! I called, my voice sharper than I intended. He appeared in the doorway, eyebrows raised. What's up? Did you eat something earlier? I asked, gesturing toward the fridge. Josh shifted his weight, leaning against the doorframe. Nah, man, I'm not hungry. Just grabbed a snack when I got here, but that's it. His answer didn't sit right. I stared at him, trying to read his expression. He wasn't looking at me. His eyes darted around the kitchen like he was avoiding something. You sure? I pressed. I said no, didn't I? His tone was defensive now, his shoulders tense. I nodded slowly, turning back to the fridge. All right, I muttered, though my gut told me something was off. If he wasn't lying, then someone or something else had been in here. I felt a chill run down my spine. Josh cleared his throat, breaking the silence. Look, man, I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm just trying to survive, same as you. Yeah, I said, not looking at him. Same as me. But as I closed the fridge and grabbed a can of soup, I couldn't shake the growing doubt gnawing at me. If I couldn't trust Josh, what the hell was I supposed to do? The night dragged on, silent except for the occasional sound of the wind outside. Josh and I ate our dinner without much conversation. The tension between us was thick, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I decided to break the silence, trying to keep the conversation light. Maybe if I acted casual, I'd get some answers. You didn't drink any water outside, right? As per the rule, I asked, taking a slow sip from my own bottle. I was trying to sound nonchalant, but my stomach was starting to churn with unease. Josh glanced up, eyes widening slightly before a nervous laugh bubbled out of him. Man, I didn't even know about these rules until you told me. I was so thirsty out there I drank from a public fountain. My heart stopped. My blood ran cold. I froze, staring at him, barely able to breathe. He didn't know about the rules, yet he'd broken one of the most critical ones. I had never told him about Rule 5, don't drink water outside. That rule was one of the first I drilled into my mind. It was too important. The air felt thick around me. Josh, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, though it came out more like a whisper. You drank from a fountain? He nodded, still laughing nervously. Yeah, man, I was so thirsty I didn't even think. I was just trying to get here. I could feel the panic rising in my chest. I couldn't hide the dread on my face anymore. I had followed the rules for hours, hell, for days, and Josh had just violated one of the most critical ones without a second thought. I couldn't let it show. I couldn't let him see how terrified I was. But inside, my mind was racing. What did this mean? Had he been infected? Was he already? I cleared my throat, trying to force a calm smile. You should have waited, I told you. The rules are the only thing keeping us alive. Josh waved it off with another chuckle, but I could see his eyes flickering with uncertainty. He didn't get it. He didn't know what I knew. My stomach twisted, nausea crawling up my throat. He was here, in my house, and he had just risked everything. The silence stretched between us, thick and uncomfortable. I stared at my water bottle, unsure whether to keep drinking it or throw it out. How long did we have before it started to matter? How long before breaking the rules had consequences I couldn't control? I gripped the bottle tighter. Ethan, you okay, man? Josh asked, his voice pulling me out of my thoughts. I blinked, suddenly aware of how hard I was squeezing the bottle. Yeah, just tired. I wasn't. I was terrified. And I wasn't sure if it was him I should be afraid of, or if it was the rules I'd been clinging to, unraveling piece by piece. The night stretched on, and the air outside felt colder, heavier, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I could feel the rising fear in my chest, but I couldn't afford to let it show. I had to act quickly. Josh's casual attitude about the rules was eating away at me. My mind raced with questions. What had he brought back with him? Was it too late for him? For both of us? "We're going to the safe zone," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. It sounded more confident than I felt. "Maybe they can check you out. Make sure you're not infected." Josh didn't argue. He just nodded, his face grim as he followed me toward the door. He was covered in dirt, scratches, the remnants of his long, brutal escape. But now, standing next to him, I realized I was more afraid of him than I ever had been. We quickly gathered what little we could: water, food, some clothes, and a flashlight, anything that might help us survive the journey. I checked the windows one last time, locking them and glancing nervously at the shadows outside. The rules were still fresh in my mind, but fear clouded my thoughts. The house felt suffocating now. The quiet was broken only by the distant sounds of the outbreak. Screams, growls, the unmistakable sound of chaos unfolding in every direction. I had to get us out of here. As we stepped outside, the night air hit us like a cold slap. I could smell smoke in the distance, smoke signals, the only way to find the so-called safe zones. The sky was thick with haze, and the stars seemed to flicker in and out, dimmed by the smoke and the swirling clouds. The world felt like it was collapsing, and I wasn't sure if there was any place safe anymore. Josh walked silently beside me, his eyes flickering to the shadows, alert but exhausted. He hadn't said much since we left the house, and I wasn't sure if it was because he felt the same tension I did, or if he was just too drained to speak. We kept moving, sticking to the streets, avoiding the main roads. Every step felt louder than the last. My heartbeat drummed in my ears as we walked, the silence between us thick and unsettling. The further we went, the closer the smoke signals seemed to get. I tried not to think about how quickly it was all falling apart. We were supposed to be safe here. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just the outbreak we needed to worry about. There were other dangers now, things that moved in the dark, things I didn't yet understand. Josh stopped abruptly, glancing over his shoulder. "What if the safe zone isn't safe?" His voice was low, almost a whisper. I hesitated, my mind spinning. "Then we keep moving," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. As we continued on, the distant sounds of the outbreak grew louder. The screams were closer now. I could hear the unmistakable shuffle of feet, the growls, the unmistakable signs of the undead. I didn't dare look back, didn't dare stop. We had to keep going. The safe zone was our only hope. We finally reached the safe zone, or what was supposed to be one. It was a small hospital, surrounded by armed officers. The building was modest, but the staff was clearly overwhelmed, working on the front lines of a world that was slipping further into chaos. As we approached, the officers stepped forward, their guns trained on us for a moment before they lowered them. "Is he infected?" one of them asked, eyes narrowing at Josh. I swallowed hard. I wasn't sure what to say anymore. I just nodded, trying to sound as calm as possible. He drank from a public fountain, right before we left. The moment the words left my mouth, I saw the medical staff exchange worried glances. That was all it took for them to make their decision. "Bring him inside," one of the staff members said, his voice low, almost grim. "Quickly." Josh didn't put up a fight, but I could see the tremor in his hands as they led him into the hospital. I followed closely, my mind racing. This had to be the right thing, right? I didn't know what was happening to Josh, but this was the only place where help might exist. As the staff began their examination, I stood back, watching in quiet horror. Josh's skin started to pale, paler than it had been when we arrived. His veins darkened, turning a sickly shade of blue under his skin, and I could see the terror in the staff's eyes as they worked. One of the nurses tried to calm him, but Josh's body began to shake violently. Then his eyes clouded over. It happened so fast I couldn't react in time. Before anyone could stop him, Josh lurched forward, his mouth opening wide in a grotesque snarl. He attacked the nearest medic, a young woman who had been trying to administer a sedative. The air was filled with a sickening screech as she screamed in terror. The officers reacted immediately, drawing their weapons and firing. But Josh, he was stronger than I expected. He broke free, his body convulsing erratically as he lunged at another medic. The man didn't even have time to raise his hands before Josh was upon him, teeth bared, claws like a wild animal. I stood frozen, my heart pounding so loudly I couldn't hear anything over the chaos. My body refused to move. This was my best friend, someone I had known for years, someone I trusted, and now he was a monster. I couldn't process it. The officers shouted orders, but it was too late. They fired again and again until Josh finally fell, slumping to the ground in a twisted heap. Silence fell over the room, broken only by the medic's frantic gasps. I could hear the officers moving forward, but I didn't say anything. I couldn't. My mind was spinning. Josh, the person I had trusted, my best friend, was gone. What was left was just an animal, a thing that had once been him. The officers checked his pulse, but there was nothing, no life. One of the medics, still shaking, wiped blood off his hands. "We need to quarantine the area," he said, his voice trembling. "We can't risk." "I know." I cut him off, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know what else to say. I was numb. They moved Josh's body away, but I couldn't look. I just stared at the ground, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But nothing about this made sense. This wasn't the world I knew. This was something else entirely. The remaining survivors in the room were either too stunned to speak or too terrified to make a sound. The reality had hit us all, but I was the only one who could truly understand what had just happened. Josh had broken the rules, and now it was too late. I knew then I was alone. I stumbled out of the hospital, my legs shaky and my mind still reeling from everything that had just happened. The weight in my chest felt unbearable. Josh, my best friend, was gone. He'd been the one person I thought I could trust in this nightmare, but now he was just another casualty. The safe zone, once a beacon of hope, was now a wreck. The gunshots still echoed in my mind. The images of Josh's final moments burned into my memory. Nothing about this world made sense anymore, but one thing had become crystal clear. Following the rules kept me alive. Josh had broken the rules, and now he was dead. It didn't matter if we were friends, if we had shared memories or laughs. The rules were all that mattered. They were the only thing standing between me and the abyss. I stood there, staring out at the chaos unfolding around me. The world was breaking down, but there was no room for weakness, no room for doubt. I couldn't afford to make the same mistake again. Trusting anyone who couldn't follow the rules was a death sentence. Survival wasn't just about staying alive anymore. It wasn't about having allies or pretending things could go back to normal. No, it was about discipline, about sticking to the rules, no matter how brutal they seemed. That was the only way to make it through. I made a silent vow right then. I would never forget what had happened. I would never forget Josh, but I would also never forget the lesson I had learned from his mistake. The rules were my lifeline. As long as I followed them, I would survive. And that was all that mattered now. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe for more creepy tales. If you'd like to support the channel, consider buying me a coffee on Ko-Fi. Every bit helps. Links in the description.